If Jeremy Corbell is super close to David Grusch, and David Grusch is super close to Mike Herrera, and Mike Herrera's testimony that he's prepared to give under oath at congressional hearings is that he saw a man-made UFO operation and has been in contact with someone from this operation. How does this information not get back to Jeremy Corbell? And why, when Jeremy Corbell is asked how far he thinks we've gotten in reverse engineering UFO technology, he says that it hasn't gotten far and that we haven't been able to make crafts of our own. This just doesn't add up. Jeremy Corbell has obviously become the face of the UFO truth movement in the major media. The question is Jeremy Corbell an asset for a limited disclosure agenda? Why would I ask if Jeremy Corbell is an asset for limited disclosure? There's a number of reasons that we're going to explore in depth today. First are his media connections. Also, his shortcomings as an authority or expert. Number 3 are his inconsistencies, and I have a star next to this because this is really the crux of what has driven me to share this information in my research on this, because there is some major inconsistencies that really we should question. And in the last part of this presentation, I'm going to share some information that's more speculative about potential connections that he might have to a long-term soft disclosure plan that perhaps has been in place for many decades and he may be unknowingly or knowingly a part of. Now, I want to preface this first by saying, no disrespect to Jeremy. I believe he could be totally innocent and have good intentions in this. But the inconsistencies that anyone can see demand questioning. And anytime that anyone is propped up as a face of any kind of issue or movement, especially one of this magnitude, the biggest secret in human history, known human history, it demands us to question why. Number 3, his narrative, part of his narrative that I've gleaned from a number of his interviews and what he's saying in this documentary and in the TMZ podcast all of this last week is misleading in the pursuit of truth. And the last point is, why is this all important? Well, because this is a huge moment in history. And the way this information comes out and how the public mind is shaped into thinking about this, because most people still think that this is fake, or just don't have the exposure to studying it that people in the UFO community do. And even then, there's confusion and disinformation. So this is a huge moment in history because it can be the difference between us getting access to potential technology that could make the world better soon, or another 50 or indefinite amount of years that it's kept secret. That's why it's important to question Jeremy Corbell. And again, no disrespect to him. I'm not coming out trying to be a hater or anything like that. But there is serious points to be questioned about him and everything that's happening. So first, we're going to take a look at his media connections. He has been the go-to spokesperson for media coverage. And we really have to ask why. This is no small deal. This isn't something to be glossed over. We know that the media hardly covers the topic, and when they do, it's usually in a sense of ridiculing it. Of course, this has changed in the last year or so, and perhaps since 2017, but Jeremy Corbell has been that guy that has been allowed to come on these major media outlets to speak about the issue. And we know that stories get taken out. We know that there are documented incidents of the CIA, for example, having control of stories and shutting down stories if they want. Bill Colby, the CIA director, testified in the Church Committee hearings that this was true. And we have other testimony. And we have in 1953 the Robertson panel and the Durant report, which suggested that the CIA control public perception of UFO through the media and television and film. So we know that they do that. And the fact that on an issue this serious, the biggest shocking secret to the world and to the power structure, do we really think that it's just random that Jeremy Corbell is the one that all of these media outlets go to? And he's the guy, he's the expert, right? You got to question that. On another point, we have to think that he must be on the radar of these intelligence agencies. If you are these intelligence agencies in the psychological warfare operations, for example, of course you're paying attention and you are controlling and manipulating to some degree what is being put out into public perception through mass media. So, they're not just looking at Jeremy Corbell and saying, yeah, he can say whatever he wants. Of course, we can reasonably assume or speculate that they have allowed him to be the one that the media talks to. But why? And that's what we should be questioning. Why has he been allowed to get to this point? Is it because his narrative doesn't risk what the agenda is of the secret keepers? We have to ask this question. And the last sub point here on the first bullet point, who's sending him these videos, right? That's kind of his thing. He releases these videos. And if you watch the TMZ documentary, he explains that he gets sent them by people inside the intelligence community. So we have to ask, who's sending him these? Again, we have documented history in the UFO subject of ufologists being given intentionally false evidence or evidence to fit a certain agenda that's out there to shape public perception. So we have to ask, who's sending him these videos and why? Okay? And now on the second bullet point, he seems to have been allowed to become this person, maybe because he works for what their agenda is, or he's been placed there. That's another possibility. And certainly with his connections to TMZ, this is significant because TMZ is owned by the Fox Corporation, by Rupert Murdoch, who is one of the top billionaires in the world, and who also, Fox Corporation produced Independence Day, The X-Files. So we have a trail here that they may have been one of the corporate media outlets that the alien UFO ET public perception operation we know has been going on, because again, David Grusch testified under oath that there has been a decades-long disinformation campaign against the American populace. That's one of his claims that nobody's really talking about. So we got to consider all this in that bigger question of, why is Jeremy Corbell the guy? Why has he been allowed to be the guy? And you see in the new TMZ documentary, it's kind of telling, I feel like. Here you have a long line of people waiting to go to this historic UFO hearing, and Jeremy walks in like he's a celebrity. He's got people taking pictures, interview him. He walks past the whole line of people, and then he gets escorted into the hearing by whoever that is, maybe some kind of security officer. So I don't know. It's just, it makes you think. And then, here you have David Grusch doing the boldest thing maybe anyone's ever done in coming out to the government, testifying all this stuff under oath. This is a huge moment. And what I have circled there is right behind him is his lawyer, who also is putting himself out there saying, I am representing this guy who's saying probably the boldest claims of anyone in our known history. And it's like Jeremy Corbell is right there, shoulder to shoulder with him, right behind David Grusch. And it's like, on some level, it's reasonable to assume that like it was allowed to get to this point. If they didn't want Grusch sitting there telling Congress this, probably it wouldn't have happened. And the fact that Jeremy Corbell is right there, and in all the pictures, he's right there with Grusch. It's kind of like, I don't know. It's just, it demands some questioning. Now, moving on from his media affiliations, which are significant, I want to turn to him as a authority figure, as an expert, as a researcher on the UFO subject. And I think that there are some noticeable shortcomings and, more importantly, inconsistencies that demand our questioning. What do I mean by this? Well, in the first point here, his knowledge seems limited for being a long-time investigator and for being the go-to spokesperson. Again, most of the news outlets bring him on and say, UFO expert Jeremy Corbell, and he leaves out a lot. And if you listen to enough interviews with him, you can tell that his knowledge is not as extensive, say, as someone like Richard Dolan. And there's lots more who've been deep researchers on this for many decades. Now, I bring up the Disclosure Project witnesses because this is where the crux of it is, and probably the best example. You have a group of military, verified, bona fide military, ex-military, coming forward with Stephen Greer in 2001 and giving a press conference at Washington, D.C., and a handful of them saying, point blank, there is a secret UFO operation with humans. That's illegal. They've figured out the technology. You have people like Robert Saltus. You have people like Clifford Stone and other people like astronaut Edgar Mitchell, who went on the record saying that he had knowledge that there was a secret reverse engineering program where they had craft and they were using them for who knows what. That's Edgar Mitchell's, the moonwalking astronaut's words, not my words. So you have all of them from the 2001 disclosure. I have yet to hear Jeremy Corbell bring up any of those cases when this question of how far have we gotten with reverse engineering gets brought up. To me, that makes me question it, because if you really study this subject and you're an expert, you gotta address those witnesses. You have to. Otherwise, you're leaving that out, and we have to ask why. Moving forward, there was a Disclosure Project conference in June in Washington, D.C., which coincidentally, Grusch came out right before that. So there's a bit of a correlation there. Why were they both in June? The Disclosure Project didn't have a press conference for 22 years. Is it really a coincidence that Grusch came out right before that? It's something to think about. But forget about 2001. Let's bring it to now. You've got witnesses like Mike Herrera and Stephen Digna, who's in the bottom right picture there, both testifying and saying that they are prepared to testify under Congress. Mike Herrera saying that he already has spoken to the Senate Intelligence Committee in a skiff about his testimony. And what's Mike Herrera's testimony? We're going to get to that in the next slide. It relates to the concept of the man-made UFOs and that there's a breakaway, illegal, not overseen group that's a combination of military and private industry individuals, a cabal, and they have the technology and they've kept it from the public and they're using it for who knows what. This is Mike Herrera's testimony, and Corbell seems to not even know about it. I don't get that. Moving to the second bullet point, and that relates to this lack of investigation into man-made UFOs. And even if you watch the Weaponized podcast recent interview with Richard Dolan brings this up and says, Richard Dolan says that he thinks it's possible that there is this breakaway group that has the technology and is using it. And Jeremy Corbell, when he's asked in the TMZ podcast a week or two later, he says that as a matter of fact that we haven't gotten far with the technology. And it just raises some questions. I don't understand that. And the last point here is that I think as an expert and an authority that the big media goes to, he has some questionable interpretations. And one example is the nuclear site incidents, which is in the TMZ documentary. And it's the instances which, if you were really an expert, you would see that all of the interventions of UFOs at nuclear facilities and with bombs and warheads have simply been to shut them down and to divert them. No attacks. So his interpretation is, and he says this in the documentary, that's them showing us that who's in charge and who's the boss. Like this aggressive interpretation where you could, just as in a valid way, interpret that as being the non-human intelligence just stopping us from making a huge mess and actually helping us. Like you could interpret that as a positive thing, but he's the talking head that millions of people are going to hear talk about this and going to influence their opinion because he's an expert, and he's saying that's them showing you we're in charge of this planet, not you. It could just be them helping us and stopping us from destroying ourselves. But, so that's why I just question his quality as an expert. And in relation to that, everyone's talking about the Jellyfish UFO now. I kind of think it's weak. I'm just going to say it. Like, if I was this propped up UFO expert about this very serious topic that people are very skeptical of, and that there's a lot of hard evidence that this is real, I wouldn't have put this out there, to be quite honest with you. Why can't it? Imagine the difference between this video, the Jellyfish UFO, and a video where you just see the flying saucer and you just see it moving. Like, that would be the end. That would be the smoking gun, so to speak. But no, it's this kind of weird, like it almost looks like a flat image, and it may really be something that we don't even understand, some type of strange technology or interdimensional technology, but I don't think it really moves forward the conversation in a powerful way. It kind of almost makes you be like, what the heck is that? Like, what's going on? Like, is it real? Like, it's weird, like it kind of, I feel like it kind of muddies the waters. And so I think it's a questionable choice to put that out there. If I were him in his position, I would be holding off for something super clear. Wow, that's a flying saucer. That's a spacecraft. But this is what comes out, and I question it. Now, moving on to his inconsistencies, and this is the big one. This is the smoking gun for why we have to question Jeremy Corbell's position in this UFO truth movement. It is established that him and David Grusch are close. He, according to him, and we see Grusch talk to him in the documentary, we know that they're close. Corbell's sitting right behind Grusch at the hearing. But we know that David Grusch is close to Mike Herrera. And according to Mike Herrera, him and David Grusch talk on a almost daily basis, and they're working together behind the scenes to kind of figure out how to move this forward. And that's been corroborated by, on the Chris Lato show, where Mike Herrera spoke, one of the few places that he gave interview, just a few military channels, podcasts. But he said he's testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mike Herrera has, about what he's saying, which we'll get to in a second here. So if David Grusch and Mike Herrera are talking on a regular basis, Mike Herrera's, his whole testimony is that when he was doing service in Indonesia, he stumbled upon this picture that you see there, a huge UFO and humans in black military gear with no insignia doing some kind of sketchy operation. He told this to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Not only that, after Herrera came out publicly at the Disclosure Conference in June of 2023, he was approached by somebody who is a senior level person that is a part of this operation, this human UFO operation. Herrera said he spoke to people in the Senate intelligence community who knew about this. It's wild. So if David Grusch and Jeremy Corbell are so close, and David Grusch and Mike Herrera are so close and working together, how does Jeremy Corbell not know about this aspect of the issue? And why, when he's being asked in interviews, how far do you think we've gotten? He says, and in the recent TMZ podcast interview, he says it matter-of-factly that reverse engineering of craft has been unsuccessful. And quote, he says, we aren't capable of reproducing our own. I don't know what more you need there with common sense and logic to question Jeremy Corbell and if he is really the right person to be the face of all this and the expert that the mainstream media talks to. Because I just don't see how this adds up. If you're a real investigator, if you're a real journalist, as he calls himself, how have you not gone deep on the Mike Herrera material? Why do you not even mention it? Especially that Herrera and Grusch are boys. That's crazy. The third bullet point down in this TMZ podcast interview, Corbell says, only derivative technologies have been developed. No crafts. And, we do have to think. And when I saw this, when I realized this is what made me think. Could he be an asset to a part of this agenda of limited disclosure, either knowingly or unknowingly? And I think there's a good chance that he is. And this is important, again, because if they can let it all come out, yes, aliens exist, yes, that UFOs are real, but if they can not even get the public to think that there could be this whole breakaway group of private and military individuals, a cabal of secrecy that has their own, that the technology is super advanced and they're doing who knows what with it, but that's what needs to come out, that could be kept for us for another 100 years. So that's why this is important. The last inconsistency I want to raise here is from the documentary, a pretty bold quote, but it doesn't make sense. This is toward the end of episode 3 of the TMZ UFO Revolution documentary, and he says that people working in the intelligence agencies who have come, that they come to him first because he's the, quote, key person they'll go to get advice on how they can safely convey information. But let's think about this for a second. Why would United States intelligence personnel, whatever level they're at, low-level agent, officer, whatever they are, to get into the CIA or something like that, it's serious. It's no joke. And you would be trained and you would be an expert in how to move information around. That's what intelligence is. Why would an intelligence agent who has information of this level and this magnitude, a secret of this magnitude, why on earth would they go to Jeremy Corbell to get advice on how they can safely convey the information? I would hope that if you're a military intelligence officer, that you would be able to advise yourself, or at least be able to go someone else in your network to advise you on the best way to safely convey information. So that quote was another red flag for me, because it's just like, that doesn't make any sense, and it makes me think that maybe intelligence agents are coming to him, and it's part of this kind of orchestrated disclosure, which might not all be bad. It just might be limited. It might be slow. Let's give him this. Let's give him this. Let's give him this. We can't talk about that yet. It's too shocking. Can't talk about that yet because we still want to control things. And maybe he's just the guy. And so these intelligence agents maybe are fed to him, because I'd have to think they would not go to him for advice. So, that's that. And all of those things that I just shared with you there, led me to this question. Is Jeremy Corbell an asset for limited disclosure? And in this last part here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some research that is worth thinking about, and a hypothesis that's worth thinking about. And again, I'm not presenting this to prove a conclusion. I'm presenting this to show that it's possible. It's possible, and the connection is not insignificant if we look at some of the data here. So in order to do this, we're actually going to be looking at Star Trek. And the first part of this is the case for Star Trek being a UFO PSYOP. There's some decent evidence to speculate about this, so let's take a look at it. Now, first of all, to understand how this applies to Jeremy Corbell, we have to understand his connections to Gene Roddenberry. Now, when he was on the Joe Rogan podcast, this jumped out at me, the connection, because he said that he grew up with Gene Roddenberry's son and is still close to him. Who's Gene Roddenberry? He is the creator, the director of Star Trek, the famous space TV series that I've actually never seen, but super popular, right? And we'll get into the context of why that matters here in its relation to UFO and U.S. intelligence operations. Now, the second bullet point, there is circumstantial evidence to hypothesize that Roddenberry was being fed info to achieve 2 psychological warfare operations on the American public. Again, David Grusch said that they've been doing that to debunk UFOs, but also to acclimate the public and to get us ready for either something unexpected happening or possibly a future disclosure. And I'm going to be drawing some of this information from Michael Sala's book and his research. Now, so we understand Corbell has that connection to Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek. He grew up and is very close with his son. But what are Roddenberry's connections to U.S. intelligence? Well, he has a connection to somebody named Leslie Stevens IV. And Leslie Stevens IV made a show called The Outer Limits, okay, which was like a sci-fi alien UFO series, but it only had 1 season and then 1 year, and then it was done. Who was Leslie Stevens IV? He was an Army Air Force intelligence officer, and his father was a high-ranking Navy admiral who we're going to look at in a second. He was involved in CIA high-level intelligence psychological warfare operations. He was the chief of one of the divisions. So Leslie Stevens IV makes Outer Limits, and Roddenberry, it's documented that Roddenberry was on the set of Outer Limits almost all the time, and that he was conferring with Leslie Stevens. And most people who have studied the history of the genesis of the Star Trek series conclude that Roddenberry definitely was getting ideas and techniques and everything that inspired him to make Star Trek was from him going on set to Outer Limits and talking to Leslie Stevens. So there's the connection, okay, to Roddenberry, to the U.S. intelligence apparatus. And the hypothesis, third bullet point, is that Roddenberry might have possibly been used as a vehicle for a soft long-term disclosure plan and simultaneously a UFO debunking. Now let's talk about Leslie Stevens IV, the Outer Limits screenwriter, who was giving Gene Roddenberry advice and possibly information. Leslie Stevens III, according to the testimony of William Tompkins, he was made aware of a secret space program. And Stevens III was into naval aeronautics. That was his specialty early on, too. He worked with Admiral Rico Botta, who William Tompkins states was involved in the Navy's operation of reverse engineering, creating spacecrafts. So again, I'm not saying that's true. This is what William Tompkins stated. You can do your research onto William Tompkins. He's actually a very significant witness who I will actually plan to do a full research and presentation on. And there's others who have alleged a Navy secret space program, but that's a whole other topic. Now, moving on to the second bullet point, back to the facts that we have. He was the chief of a joint subsidiary plans committee, and he was the chief of the Psychological Warfare and Covert Operations Unit, which was liaising with the CIA in 1949. And This was essentially a group to work with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they're the ones who advise the president on what to do. So he was the head of a division of psychological warfare and covert operations that would advise the president what to do. So highest level stuff. And to my third bullet point here, if the secret space program is real, and that's one of the big questions that we shouldn't give up on investigating, then there's a high likelihood that he would have been read in or involved in the program. And if that's the case, and we see the link from Stevens III to Stevens IV to Roddenberry to possibly Roddenberry's son and to Corbell being super close with him and Corbell being obsessed with UFOs and the whole subject, and whose life mission is to get to the bottom of this, we can see that there would be a link. And it's worth questioning. So, was Leslie Stevens IV a psychological operations agent? So the rumors are that when the son, Stevens IV, creator of Outer Limits, when he retired, he remained an asset to his father's psychological warfare unit because he was out of the military, but his father was still the chief of this operation. And, let's look at the connections. In 1953, the CIA Robertson panel, which was tasked with look at the UFO issue and tell us what your recommendations are, and the CIA released something called the Durant Report, which recommended to debunk UFOs via Hollywood and the media. So let's think about this logically. You're the chief staff of this division, liaising with the CIA. In 53, this is what they come out and recommend. Your son is a former intelligence operative and is a talented screenwriter. Would you maybe think, maybe he could accomplish some goals for us through his screenwriting? And on the third bullet point, the idea here is that this would be the theory is that this would be like a truth in plain sight psychological operation. And this has been referenced, for example, in a leaked Edward Snowden NSA document where it's a masking, mimicking technique. And, so this leads us to the question, was Star Trek a PSYOP? Stevens IV could have briefed Roddenberry, right? Because maybe they didn't want to do it straight through Stevens IV with Outer Limits. It did die off after one season. So maybe he passed on some of this information about the deepest secrets. He might have passed it on to Roddenberry, who then went on and created Star Trek and used that information as the basis for his fiction, which was maybe a mixture of truth and fiction, maybe some kind of soft disclosure. And what would this do? The second bullet point, Star Trek could have served as a dual purpose. Number one, serving as a ridicule factor to debunk them. Because now if people say, let's say a real person's like, yeah, I saw a portal or this and that, or someone that was on a secret space program says, yeah, I was a part of this or that, the public would psychologically say, oh, you're just getting that from Star Trek. Or they would just think that's ridiculous. Like that's in the movies, that's in the TV show. You're just making that up because you got inspired by it. So it serves that purpose. And then at the same time, it acclimates the public, right, to get used to this over long periods. And, there's rumors from some of these insiders that they decided, this is a long-term thing. Let's do this through Hollywood, through the media. Let's do this slow. We got to keep people debunking and ridicule them, but we also have to acclimate the public to this idea in case something happens, like they just show up, so there won't be as much mass panic, or in case of like a really actual truthful disclosure in the future. So it's interesting. Again, we have this circumstantial evidence to explore this hypothesis, and this is not proof that this is true, but it does make us think. And so that's where the Corbell connection comes in, right? If Roddenberry was briefed on a deeper UFO reality, and Star Trek was an extension of a psychological operation, then the connection of Gene Roddenberry's son to Jeremy Corbell is significant. Close friends with his son, and he has this celebrity level interest in UFOs. So you would think if you were this much into UFOs and on the highest level of celebrity status right now of being a UFO investigator, you would think that connection to Roddenberry and Star Trek, and were they seeping out some kind of psychological information, would be a significant avenue of inquiry. And, on to the third bullet point, this may add some, questions to, could he be an intelligence asset unknowingly or knowingly? And I think both are possible, that he's just doing he has good intentions. He's maybe just not that thorough of an investigator, or he might know about this all. He might be connected to and know that he might have got the deepest secrets that, Star Trek was part of this long-term thing, like we're trying to drip it out, and he might feel like he's doing the right thing, protecting national security, protecting public interests. So, and certainly some of his comments in interviews would suggest that. So in conclusion, number one, look, Jeremy Corbell could be totally innocent. He could just be doing his best honest investigation, and he's just not that good. Number two, like I was just saying, unknowingly or potentially knowingly, he could be pushing a limited disclosure narrative. In any case, on the third point, my conclusion is that he is not the best person to be leading the way. In my opinion, we need the full truth to come out, or else we could be looking at 50 more years, 100 years, indefinitely, of secrecy, of the deeper stuff, and potentially the suppression of technology that would change the world. And, to add to this idea that he's really not the best person to be the face of this, in the TMZ documentary, if you catch it, it's only one little sentence or two. He admits himself that he's unqualified to be this person. And nevertheless, he's still an important investigator, still appreciate what he's done to help out with this, but given the information that we have talked about here today, I think there are strong grounds for questioning him. Even if you rule out the entire Star Trek thing, that's kind of just like an added dimension of interest. Even if you rule out that his connection to the huge media and the Fox Corporation and Rupert Murdoch and all that, even if you rule that out as being just a coincidence, which I think is nearsighted, people don't just rise up to the top of the media without checking off certain boxes. I think it's very reasonable to assume that with a high degree of probability. But even if you rule all that out, the crux of this whole questioning that demands an answer is the simple fact that he's super close with David Grusch. David Grusch is super close with Mike Herrera. Mike Herrera's testimony that he's given to the Senate, that he's prepared to testify under oath, is that he is aware and has seen with his eyes a man-made illegal UFO operation with advanced technology made by humans from reverse engineering. How is Jeremy not talking about that? Why, when he's being asked that question point blank, he's saying matter-of-factly that we haven't gotten anywhere with it? This demands answers, and it raises up my red flag. So you'll have to decide for yourself, where are we going with this? And again, it's important because if the full truth doesn't come out in this opportunity we have now, we could be looking at the rest of our lives still living off of oil and this kind of paradigm that we're in here of a limited reality and a freedom and a better society on Earth. And so this is just where I've pulled some of this information from: the Joe Rogan podcast, the Michael Salla book, the TMZ podcast interview, and then the TMZ documentary, which I recommend you go watch. 3-part series just came out. I'm going to be doing a whole video on it because I watched the whole thing, and I think there's some real interesting stuff to read between the lines on. So thank you for watching, and I hope this will help you navigate your own, because ultimately, at the end of the day, we got to think for ourselves, and we have to look at all the data and come to logical conclusions. Unfortunately, I'll say it, and I think we have to be critical, and we have to question things. This is what democracy is. This is what being a civilization and society is. Question people. And I think Jeremy Corbell does need to be questioned for the reasons I've highlighted. And we need to have people leading this who are more incisive and are doing a full, true investigation and coming to strong, logically valid conclusions. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.